Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and thank you to viewers around the world for tuning into today's EWC Seminars Live. I'm Susan Kreifels, Media Program Manager at the East-West Center. Our program today, Divided by History, focuses on the historic divides between India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine, and Korea and Japan. We have a group of respected senior journalists from these countries who will share with us the challenges of reporting cross-border conflicts, reporting balanced, objective, and fully covered stories with diverse perspectives, not only from their own country, but also from the other side of an often hostile border. This can be professionally challenging with pressure to report from a nationalist point of view, but it can sometimes also threaten their personal safety. For the last 20 years, the East-West Center has engaged journalists in a series of programs that focus on reporting cross-border issues of mutual, often sensitive and volatile concern among Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asian countries. These cross-border media programs include reporting trips, dialogues, and workshops to provide firsthand information, build sustained information networks, encourage media collaboration, and better inform their audiences about their neighbor countries. In recent years, we have focused on cross-border programs between India and Pakistan, with a total of 280 alumni of these programs. Participants have created a website called Journalists for Change that focuses on their cross-border stories, projects, and collaborations. Please link to journalistsforchange.org and see the important work these journalists are pursuing. Now I am proud to introduce our impressive lineup of panelists today. Aditi Phadnis, consulting political editor and former national political editor at Business Standard in New Delhi. She is an East-West Center 2006 Jefferson Fellow. Kamal Siddiqui, director of Center for Excellence in Journalism at IBA and former editor of the Express Tribune in Karachi. He was also a 2006 Jefferson Fellow. Shira Rubin is Israel-Palestinian Territories correspondent for the Washington Post. She is based in Tel Aviv. Khaldun Bakherti, Israeli Affairs Editor at Al Hayat Al Jadida, based in Ramallah, Palestine. He is an alumnus of the East-West Center 2014 Senior Journalist Seminar. Takitsuku Sato, Senior Foreign Affairs and National Security Correspondent at the Asahi Shimbun, and he is based in Tokyo. Sontek Wang, Research Associate at Yoshije, the Future Consensus Institute, and former diplomatic correspondent, YTN News Network in Seoul. He was a speaker at the fourth East-West Center's East-West Center's International Media Conference in Seoul in 2012. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to take a moment to share our webinar protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and will be made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off. Each panelist will speak up to 5 minutes and take a question from the moderator. Q&A will take place after journalist remarks, about 50 minutes into the program. To submit a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and specify if there is a particular panelist you wish to answer. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios, and YouTube links at www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities, as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. Finally, I am delighted to introduce today's moderator, Owen Ullman, executive editor, the International Economy magazine, and former managing editor of World News at USA Today. He is based in Washington, D.C., and is an alumnus of our 2015 China Study Tour for U.S. journalists. Owen, I'm going to hand the program over to you, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good evening, good morning, perhaps good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us. As Susan pointed out, long-running conflicts over territory, religion, ethnicity, sometimes all three, and especially those rooted in deep animosities, pose real challenges for journalists on both sides of these volatile borders as they try to report balanced and objective stories. And as Susan mentioned, we have a very distinguished panel of journalists to discuss three of the most intractable disputes. One, of course, is in the Middle East, where a bitter conflict over a Jewish and Palestinian homeland has biblical roots. The modern conflict has raged ever since the creation of the Israeli state in 1948. As you all know, there have been multiple wars, countless deaths, suffering, and progress toward any kind of peaceful solution has really stalled for a number of years now. We've seen the conflict flare only in recent weeks between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The second dispute of great animosity is Japan and South Korea tensions. The Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945 and its abuses of the civilian population, such as the enslavement of comfort women, continue to drive tensions between the two countries, Japan and South Korea. And while the two nations have bilateral relations and have avoided any war and military conflict, disputes remain over issues such as compensation and territorial claims over islands. And the final dispute we'll talk about is the Kashmir region. This territory has been in dispute ever since the partition of British India in 1947 into predominantly Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. 3 wars and countless incidents of violence have erupted over the ensuing decades between these nuclear-armed rivals. Rebellions against Indian rule in Kashmir have resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. So how do journalists cover these disputes without bias when even basic facts are in dispute? Are the Kashmiri separatists terrorists or are they freedom fighters? Do we call the West Bank Palestine or is it Palestinian territory? Is it the Sea of Japan or is it the East Sea? With such deep-rooted disputes, it becomes very challenging for the journalists, and of course, also their personal safety may be at risk when there is a conflict. So we'll begin with the Middle East. I might say that Aditi was having some trouble with her video, so in case she has not joined us yet, we'll save that segment for last. So we'll begin looking at the Middle East conflict, and first I'm glad to introduce Haldun Bagati to talk about his coverage of the Israeli and Palestinian dispute.
Thank you, Owen, and I would like to thank everybody for this opportunity. I don't know if you want to get to the same plan. Edith is, I think she's here. If you would like to go to it, it's okay with me.
Although we'll just continue currently as the way we are.
Okay. So I think being Palestinian, covering the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is difficult because it's not like you're coming from another country to cover the conflict between both sides. I'm not British, I'm not American, I'm Palestinian. And what's happening here is that it's difficult to distinct yourself from your people when covering the conflict with the Israeli occupation. In fact, for us, this is how we always describe it. This is how it's described in the United Nations resolutions. What happens is that the main problem is the Palestinian journalist for Israeli forces and for Israeli even politicians, he's Palestinian before he's a journalist. It's not only goes to a Palestinian journalist, even paramedics, for example, in the field, they are Palestinians before they are paramedics. And we saw a lot of casualties among both sides, journalists and paramedics in clashes, whether they were like West Bank clashes and whether they are military clashes like what happened recently in Gaza. So when you're covering when you are there in the field, and it happened with me, you may face offenses by the Israeli forces against you just because you are there. You're a Palestinian first and journalist later. I think, I don't know if you saw the recent videos of Al Jazeera correspondent. She's Palestinian working in Jerusalem. She was in the main, let's say, point of tension in the city, a Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where some Israeli settlers are working on confiscating some Palestinians and kicking the Palestinians from their homes there, claiming that it was a Jewish property before 1948. Jivar al-Buderi is one of the very known journalists working in Jerusalem. The soldiers themselves, or the policemen, knows her there. But she was asked for her press pass, although they knew who she was. And she said, it's in the car. Just by this, she was attacked, she was handcuffed, she was dragged to the police car, she was beaten in the car, and on the walkie-talkie they were just saying that we got Jivar al-Buderi of Al Jazeera. So you knew who she was, and it's just you wanted to kick Al Jazeera from that field. They smashed the camera of her cameraman, and she was taken to the police station. She was not allowed to get to the area for 14 days by the Israeli police. But this thing does not happen to Israeli journalists, for example, covering the same events. This is how the Palestinian journalist finds himself part of the aggression made by the Israeli forces. So when we describe, for example, the Israeli Defense Army, this is the official name. For the Palestinians, it's Israeli Occupation Army. You can't say it's defense while you are under offense from that side. This is what happens. What happens also is your house may be demolished, and they don't care if you're a journalist or not. You may be arrested, and there are several Palestinian journalists in Israeli prisons because of their working as journalists sometimes. In Israel, if you talk about occupation, you could be accused of incitement. If you post something on Facebook, you may find yourself in prison because, first of all, you're Palestinian, then you are anything else. And I faced that on checkpoints when I was going to my work, and during the worst day of closure in the West Bank, they didn't care if you have a Palestinian press pass because they don't recognize it. They don't recognize the Palestinian syndicate of journalists. They want you to have an Israeli journalist. And if you have one, for example, like what happened with Jivar al-Buderi of Al Jazeera and Al-Quds, they don't care. First, you're Palestinian. She was treated like any demonstrator, and she was arrested. When it comes on the other side, for example, Israeli journalists, a military analyst and a reporter called Ronnie Daniel, I think of Channel 12, in 2006 or 2008, he was live. And he said that he would like to see Gaza destroyed totally, like what happened in Beirut in 2006. And you are a journalist, and he asked the Israeli army to launch stronger strikes and attacks against Gaza. I think as a journalist, you could not demand these things from an army in war. So he put himself as an Israeli before being, or let's say, a pro-war journalist, before putting himself in an objective journalist. This is what happens.
Could you wrap up, please, to make sure we have time for the other speakers? Thank you.
Yeah, yes. So, as a Palestinian journalist, it's easier for me to cover the Israeli, let's say, relations, the Israeli political developments, like what we saw recently, and therefore informing their government. All these things are very much easier for me to cover objectively than covering the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because myself could be the victim next time in the way the Israeli occupation forces are dealing with the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hold on. And now we'll hear from Shira Rubin.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone as well. So I think what Khaldun mentions is something that we all struggle with, which is that the international and the local press is very much a front in any war, any conflict that happens here. I mean, the strategies on both sides take into account very much how it's perceived within and without the respective countries. And so, yes, it's very difficult. I mean, I think it's getting difficult. It's getting more difficult with each year as we kind of wade ever more into this era of overexposure. And there is just so much, so much that is known about what's happening here. And of course, there's this spotlight on Israel-Palestine that is historic. This war, actually, this past war last month, was a kind of turning point in that whole saga in terms of the Israeli army actually using international press. We assume, it was never confirmed, but we assume by telling us, the Washington Post and many others, the Wall Street Journal, the Times, that they were about to launch a ground invasion in Gaza, in the midst of the fighting, and that, made its way, that word made its way to Gaza, and the idea, the interpretation of that mistake potentially was that it was intended to encourage the Hamas fighters to take certain positions so that they could be in the targets that the army wanted them to be. So in that case, the international press found itself in a very strange, awkward, ethically bizarre position, which says a lot about, just kind of the reality that we're facing in general here, which is nothing is ever straightforward, and we can never really separate ourselves, because even if we want to, we are part of the story. We are part of everyone's story. It's all intermingled very, very tightly, very uncomfortably at sometimes. And, the only thing we can do as journalists to try to maintain objectivity is to, just go back on the fundamentals of our journalistic ethics, to source rigorously, to make sure that everything is balanced in every single detail of this, because in Israel-Palestine, it's not just what goes on the ground, it's also the symbolism, it's the presentation of what goes on here that makes the story, and in some ways can make the difference between a war or a peace. So yes, like Khaldun was saying, Palestinian journalists have found themselves in the midst of this, being attacked, in fact, for being journalists and for being Palestinian journalists, international journalists as well. It's an ongoing question, what exactly our role is in terms of reporting, and also reporting Hamas's narrative versus Israel's narrative, and to what extent it kind of encourages or influences either side. There are no simple answers, but I mean, we can discuss it further here. Thanks, Owen.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I think both of you did an excellent job explaining just how difficult it is to cover this conflict and the pressures that each of you face. The question I would ask both of you is, given how important it is for Palestinians and Israelis to know what is really going on, it's important for them to know the facts, sometimes even if the facts are not good news for them. How do you each assess the honesty and the trustworthiness of your respective governments to provide any kind of accurate information, as opposed to propaganda, which we know we've seen on both sides has been common and has been uncovered subsequently? Why don't we begin with Khaldun?
Please, the question again. I was just reading a message.
Sorry. How do you assess how accurate and honest the information you get, let's say when you're covering a conflict, from Hamas, let's say, or the Palestinian Authority on the facts on the ground? Do you just accept what they say, or do you try to do an independent reporting to confirm the Palestinian version of events?
It's very difficult. When it comes, for example, to Gaza, it's very difficult to get more information than what is published, what is posted by, let's say, their spokespersons. I think Shira knows that also. You sometimes you get a one-line message, and that's all. And you don't have access to their, for example, military spokesperson. For us also, and that's could be awkward for you, that when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, it's easier for Israeli and international journalists to get information from the PA, the Palestinian Authority officials, than the Palestinian journalists. And this is always has been criticized by the Palestinian journalists towards the Palestinian officials, and how they give more, let's say, importance to Israel and international journalists than the Palestinian journalists themselves. This is one of the point of weakness of maybe Palestinian journalist syndicate here in supporting the Palestinian journalists try to get the information from the Palestinian officials. It's not easy. Sometimes it depends on your personal relation more than being a journalist. Sometimes it depends on who you work for. That's when they give you the information, or when they refuse to give you the information. We had recently the issue of the Pfizer 100,000 doses that were given or let's say swapped between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And it was kind of a scandal. And then like they decided to give the Palestinian 100,000 or 1 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine that are supposed to expire at the end of this month, or part of them. And it was rejected by the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority took time to tell us what happened. They did not answer the question. We get more information from the Israeli side media outlets than what we got from the Palestinian Authority spokesperson. And when they came out, it was, for us, it was a scandal that requires someone to quit his job. It's not easy here to do that.
Right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. How about you, Sharon?
Yes, it's very true that what organization you're coming from and what language you're speaking culturally and linguistically really affects how you can get the right information, or as close to the right information as possible. In truth, in Gaza, for example, during the war, it was very difficult to go on anything besides the official count or the official publications. But I mean, I think the best strategy that we've used is to kind of use all fronts at the same time, using a Gaza local to use his own connections to try to figure out what's happening. And also for us, to understand this is not the first time that we've seen a conflict like this. So we know that there are certain patterns. So if something comes up that is a little bit suspicious, then yes, it can raise red flags for us, but at the end of the day, it is really difficult to objectively and decisively report facts, especially in a place like Gaza where we don't necessarily have access. Our reporters weren't allowed in until after the fighting ended. So sometimes it's really going on, as best as we can do. And we make that very clear in the reporting that this is what is reported, and if there's anything else to substantiate that either way, we include that as well. But yes, it is kind of a strange paradox when I, as someone living in Israel, I'm trying to report on something happening in Palestine, and all the sources I'm getting are sightings of Israeli press, which is happening, like you said, Khaldun, with the recent controversy this past week with the COVID swap to the PA, which was it just shows so many problems with reporting here. One of them is that by citing non-local sources, by secondhand citing reporting, a lot of facts get lost. Like even Khaldun, you mentioned that a million 1 million vaccine doses were sent to the PA, which were about to expire. And that factually is not true. There were 100,000 that were sent to expire, and the rest were meant to expire end of July or end of August. So when there is that secondhand reporting, a lot gets lost. And I spoke to a lot of Palestinians who told me, you know, in this COVID controversy now, and also during the war, you know, there's so much that's not known. There's so much that's not clear. So you really do need to wade through the facts and just try to get to as high or as close to the actual source as you can. Sometimes it's not possible. You just have to kind of try as hard as you can.
Thank you, Shira, and thank both of you for your insightful comments, and also to remind us just how dangerous it is to cover this region. And we certainly appreciate the courage that you and your colleagues show in trying to bring what's going on in that region to your readers and your viewers. Let's now go to a different region. We'll go to Asia and talk about the Korean-Japan tensions, and we'll begin with Takasugo Sato.
Hi, thank you. My name is Takesu Sato. Thank you for your kind introduction, Owen. And I would like to say thank you to East-West Center to host a wonderful event. It's my great honor to participate in this event, which focuses on important topics for seeking crew to overcome the confrontation between us. As Owen explained, Japan and Korea have mainly two historical issues: comfort women issue and forced labor related to World War II, and a territorial dispute about islands in Sea of Japan named Takeshima in Japanese and Dokdo in Korea over 300 years. I think the big problem in Asia is that the nationalism has been emerging on each country, Japan, Korea, and China. And the national leader tried to use nationalism as their diplomatic tools to gain the domestic support. My personal view on Japanese side, then Prime Minister Abe tried to mobilize anti-Korean sentiment among Japanese people for his political gain. For example, as a countermeasure of Korean Supreme Court's judgment on forced labor, Abe administration ejected South Korea from the so-called white list of countries which entitled to receive preferential treatment in trade. And now Abe has gone, but even after Suga took power last year, the cold relation is continuing. Japan and ROK has not been held summit meeting for 1.5 years since Abe Moon meeting in China. As you know, in the G7 summit in British this month, reportedly Korean side proposed an official meeting with Prime Minister Suga for 20 or 30 minutes, but Japanese side rejected the proposal. So I believe Suga is not a nationalist, but he has to pretend to be a hardliner because he needs support from the right wing, the base of Abe supporter, in order to stable the political power. So under Koizumi administration, the diplomatic relation between Japan and Korea is not so good because of Koizumi's visiting Yasukuni Shrine, but it did not spread to military cooperation. However, under Abe administration, the bad relationship developed into a serious friction on even the defense cooperation between Japan and Korea. For example, ROK threatened to end GSOMIA, military intelligence sharing accord, finally resolved it, but in 2008, fire control radar lock-on incident was happened, which Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force patrol aircraft was locked on by South Korean worship leader. So I think the political confrontation amplifies anti-Korea or anti-Japanese sentiment. Their sentiment make a politician on both sides to be more hardline. It's getting difficult for two sides to compromise each other. We are stuck in a negative cycle. Anti-Korean sentiment among the people is emerging. Let me share the data which a opinion poll conducted by Japanese government. In 2009, 26% Japanese feel affinity toward ROK. But now, in 2020, only 65% feel affinity toward Korea. It's a huge drop from 63% to 35%. So that's my anxiety things. But I've been explained so negative things. But lastly, I will share the good news, which is a cultural exchange. It is the fact that Korean TV drama and K-pops are huge booming right now in Japan. Some Japanese girls who are taken with K-pop goes to Korea to join the K-pop units. So we are now in a tunnel, but we can see the tiny light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Takasuga. And now we'll have Son Taek Wang.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am honored to be joining in this meaningful event. Today, I'd like to introduce several key words which might help understanding the relationship between Korea and Japan. First keyword I prepared is victim mentality. Whenever there is a history issue with Japan, Koreans recall the time of being annexed by Japan from 1910 to 1945. It was really a hard time to Koreans and an indelible disgrace to Koreans. Dispute itself irritates a deeply wounded scar from the time when we were weak, stupid, incompetent, so that we were beaten, enslaved, and killed. Second keyword is no flexibility zone. As the trauma of Korean society is so strong, there is almost no space for a flexibility on the issue of Japan. Actually, almost all Koreans are frustrated, disappointed, or angered by the attitude of Japan. We Koreans think Japan is not so sincere about the past wrongdoings, such as Japanese textbook do not educate young students the wrongdoings, war crimes under the imperial Japanese leadership. Japan does not show a sense of remorse on the matter of comfort women. Japan does not show an honest response on the matter of the forced laborers. Japan claims the Korean island of Dokdo is their land. Japan tries to put some nasty sanctions against Korea. As almost all Koreans agree on the points above, nobody in Korea, nobody would like to make a different argument. Those topics are simply a no flexibility zone in Korea. The third keyword is domestic politics. Domestic politics of both nations, I think, deteriorate the relationship between the two nations. There have been long lists of politicians in Korea who periodically try recurring animosity against Japan. Usually they did that because they think they are in an unfavorable situation domestically, and they need some opportunities to change it. There is no space for them to think about national interests, unfortunately. That might be the similar story in Japan too, I think. For more than 20 years, right-wing voices continuously growing. The organization of right-wing politicians has remarkably grown, and one of the political manipulations for the right-wing group is a Korea bashing, I understand, because there is an anti-Japanese sentiment in Korea, and anti-Japanese sentiment is a good prey for them. And the fourth keyword is mediator, the United States. As Korea and Japan could not find enough motivation to improve the relations, it is necessary for the United States to make the two allies reconcile, cooperated each other, because trilateral alliance would be more effective than operating two segments of bilateral alliance. Due to the US efforts, the two nations normalized the relations in 1965 and agreed to finish the issue of comfort women in 2015. However, President Donald Trump was coming in 2016 and did not like meddling the other nations. As the US dropped out of the mediating role, Korea and Japan could not find a way to avoid a head-on collision, I think. But lastly, a status changed. Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world when it was liberated in 1945. The economic gap between the two nations were far beyond the normal explanation, as everybody knows. However, Korea has constantly developed and upgraded to a top 10 economy in the world recently. When Korea was a poor and weak nation, Japan showed some sense of tolerance. As a big and rich nation, even the excessive demands from Korea were handled as small things to Japan. However, Korea has grown to an advanced level nation. It is not easy anymore for Japan to show tolerance or patience when they think Koreans demanded too much or whatever criticisms from the former annexed nation. Nowadays, Japan is trying to use full strength when they want to put pressure on Korea. Those are the points I'd like to introduce today. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Suntek. Both of you, I thought, gave very interesting presentations on just what the tensions are, and it raises a very interesting question for both of you, which is, given the nationalistic fervor that we're witnessing in the region as well as in China, but particularly in your own countries, do you feel pressure that you have to help promote that narrative? Do you try to engage in any kind of self-examination or introspection about why there is so much hostility between the two countries to maybe help people find a resolution? And are you criticized if you try to go against that strong, anti-Korea, anti-Japan sentiment in your respective countries? Why don't we begin with Takasugu?
Yes, thank you for your good question. As you mentioned, when my newspaper criticized Abe or Suga administration, Suga administration's approach toward Korea, we sometimes face a harsh backlash from the right wing, especially online right winger. As you know, along with the social polarization, Japanese medias have been divided on ideology and foreign policy approach. But I think there are two hints to overcome our confrontation. One is, as you mentioned, strategic thinking, strategic perspective. As a journalist, through our media, I'm trying to encourage Japanese government and Japanese public to think about our relationship from a strategic perspective, especially under the current severe security environment. I believe both Japan and ROK are in the front line on US-China competition. We have to imagine who enjoy the situation on Japan-Korea bad relations. So, China and the DPRK, North Korea. So I think Japan and South Korea have to cooperate each other to counterbalance or hedge Chinese and North Korean aggression. The second hint is US commitment. Mr. Sontek explained, I believe the US law or commitment is important to mitigate the tension between Japan and Korea. When I was Washington Washington, as a Washington correspondent, Obama administration emphasized historical conciliation. However, President Trump was not interested in a historical conciliation and did not care about the relation between Japan and Korea. So I hope President Biden administration tried to do something Obama did on historical issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And how about you, Sontek? Would you like to respond?
Yes, as I try to talk 5 points in my remark, I think we can get some hints from those points. First point I talked is victim mentality of Korean society. I think we need Korean society needs some kind of program to cure, to change that mentality. So if we can, if we are successful about the victim mentality, I think we can get some good situation for us to go forward. Second point, no flexibility zone is closely related to the first point. If we can, in the current leadership, we can get some more space for flexibility. And this third point, domestic politics, one of the real big problem for South Korean side too. But we need to educate politicians. Good relations, improvement of two nations are good for national interests of both countries and also good for their political gain. We need to make some logic for this education. Then number 4, as Mr. Sato said, we need to expect the bigger role of the United States, meddling the two countries. And then lastly, maybe Japanese society probably understand Korean economic situation is get better and better and higher. Is now Japan, South Korea is ready to talk with Japan in a kind of reciprocal manner. These are some thoughts about it.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks for a very stimulating conversation about that region. And now I'm pleased to say that Aditi is with us, so we can now go to talk about the Kashmir dispute. So Aditi, take it away.
Hi. I have to say that in relations between India and Pakistan, there is a lot more than just Kashmir. India and Pakistan live in a self-created hostile environment. For any reporter, this should be lifeblood of reporting. But because of the high walls that our government and the state has created for us, we cannot visit each other, we cannot discover our two countries for ourselves and have to rely on third hand, mainly Western and now Chinese sources of information. Try and messily put aside the biases of the interlocutors and then represent each other's countries to our readers. This is quite a complex process because filtering out many layers of biases is quite a difficult job. I'll give you an example of the biases, for instance. I first went to Pakistan ever in the early 1990s. It's a neighbor, we speak the same language, we have the same customs, but I did not go to that country till the early 1990s. And I was so captivated by it that I applied for the 2006 Jefferson program run by the East-West Center only and only because it was designed around a visit to Pakistan. On that visit, we visited some seminaries and we learned about Pakistani Islam, which is quite different from Islam elsewhere in the world. I found nothing at all unnatural about the way the children were studying at the seminary, but my colleagues from America and some of the Asian press were appalled at the rhythmic forward movement of the bodies of the children as they rocked to memorize the verses of the Quran. For them, it was as if they were under some possessed spirit or something. This is entirely natural. It happens in India also. For them, the takeaway was that these legions of little children, some of whom would be frontline Taliban and Mujahideen fighters leading suicide squads, which no doubt some of them might have been, were in the future. But for me, the takeaway was that Pakistani Islam has many versions. And while memorizing the Quran is one part, Islamic education can also be forward and modern and forward looking and progressive. This gives a completely new perspective to the way you look at the rise of Islamic parties in Pakistan. So I discovered this to, for myself rather than having to decode it from other places. But there are other challenges also. In the pre-internet age, which also I have seen, you couldn't, there was, the challenge was of information. You just couldn't get any. But now there is so much information sloshing around. How much of it do you know to be accurate? How can you judge what is actually happening in those areas in Pakistan? I've tried to develop a network of friends and have encouraged other colleagues to do so. Our own coalition of the willing, if I may, because of friends help, the help of friends like Kamal, who will speak next. I was able to report better on the reasons why Pakistan did not come to the military aid of a friendly brother country like Saudi Arabia in its war on Yemen. It had many layers of understanding and complexity, which I found very, very interesting. So it's not only about covering a war zone, it's about covering a country and its politics and its economy in its totality, which is crucial. But the biggest challenge I find hardest to overcome is the challenge of nationalism, as my other colleagues have mentioned. This becomes even more acute when our two nations fight, which is often. As an army wife, I cannot ignore the decapitated bodies of soldiers flung back into Indian territory by Pakistan's military. But I'm also deeply skeptical of claims, for instance, made by one of my colleagues in her recent book, that India was on the verge of using the nuclear weapon in the 1999 Kargil conflict, which was its information given to her, no doubt accurately, by India's national security advisor at the time, Rajesh Mishra. But you have to question what is being given to you at a given time. There is a fallout on social media if your stories try to explain Pakistan. It is tragic. We could go all misty-eyed about how we've been divided by colonial powers and we are actually one nation that must come together again. But we shouldn't and we can't come together again. We are now two sovereign nations with our own governance systems, and all we can do is manage the relationship. I feel my responsibility as a reporter is to report truthfully and accurately the management of the relationship and find the right people to blame when they botch it up. For this, we need to know much more about each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. And it's good to hear, as I'm not surprised how journalists across countries can help one another. We're kind of all in it together. So now we'll hear from Kamal.
Thank you. Aditi, thank you for what you've said. I think I'll just follow up on what Aditi has said in terms of what our role is as journalists. I've listened, Khaldun has said some very important things. My other colleague, Shira, has also said some things very important. First of all, I think, what is our role? We are journalists. We are observers. We are not participants. I think that's the biggest issue right now. I think this is something that Aditi has also in some ways referred to, that with nationalism, I think the expectations on us are very different. The expectations are that we will be part of this national agenda. I don't want to be part of any national agenda. I want to be a journalist. That's the first thing. The second thing, I want to report things as they are. I don't want to report what the national narrative tells me. That puts me in a problem situation with my government, with people around my government who obviously want me to report on things that they want me to report on, not on things that I want to. I've worked, so interestingly, in between Pakistan and India, what Aditi has also referred to is how she has talked about how we're looking at, when we're looking at journalism, when we're looking at reporting, initially there was an arrangement between the Pakistan and Indian governments whereby there would be 3 Indian journalists in Pakistan, and there'd be 3 Pakistani journalists in India who would be reporting. Needless to say, over the past couple of years, over the past decade, in fact, those journalists are not there. So it is left to stringers. It is left to people who are, like, for example, in Pakistan, Pakistanis who report for Indian publications to actually convey what's happening on one side. Now, I have reported initially, I reported for the Indian Express as a stringer, and then I reported for the Hindustan Times. At the same time, I've also been an editor for National English Language Daily. So I can see in terms of the appetite, and the appetite, like Khaldun mentioned this. Khaldun said that if you want to know about what's happening in Palestine, you should look at Israeli newspapers. I think the same way, if you want to know what's happening in Pakistan, it's a better option to find out what's happening. You can get much more information from Indian newspapers because there's so much appetite for Pakistani news. In fact, when I was a stringer, there was so much appetite for Pakistani news that I was constantly being asked questions about, what's happening here. And it's not just politics. It's about show business. It's about social life. It's about a lot of things. My problem right now, as I see it, is that journalists have become participants. Journalists have become activists. Very recently, there was a protest in Karachi over something, and 3 journalists gave themselves up for arrest as part of the protest. Now, as I much respect them, this is not what journalism is for me. Journalism for me is that you sit on one side, what Shira was saying, sit on one side, report. You are not a participant, you are an observer. So that's one. Our problem between Pakistan and India is that, first of all, they've closed off journalists from one side or the other reporting. Even when we had Indian journalists in Pakistan, they were very much restricted. My colleague Amit Barua, who used to write for the Hindu, his movements were monitored. He could not leave Islamabad, but he was still able to give some picture to the Indian audience about what Pakistan is. There are a lot of misconceptions, and he was able to clear some of them. What I'm seeing now is that those misconceptions, those half-truths, because we don't have Indian journalists in Pakistan and we don't have Pakistani journalists in India, those half-truths are being perpetuated. A lot of things in India about Pakistan are not true when they're reported because they're reported by people who are sitting in India. And the same way with Pakistan. So that's one problem. With stringers, with people who are like Pakistanis reporting on India, they have a lot of things to consider. Like when I was reporting for Hindustan Times, I had to be very careful about what I could say because at the end of the day, I'm a Pakistani and the intelligence agencies would. And interestingly, they were very, in terms of what they were reading, what they were analyzing, they're very quick to understand that what this person is saying and try to influence him. So again, the role of the media, one last point I'd like to make is that fake news. What's happened is that when we shut off, when we close this independent journalists from being in one country or the other, fake news is there, very much there. It proliferates. And we've seen that on social media platforms. A lot of stories about Pakistan in India and vice versa are not true. But there's no way to contradict them because the person on ground is not there. I'll stop here. I know in many instances, Owen, I know you have, you'll stop me, but there's lots to say on this, but I will stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm the bad cop, I guess. Well, thank you very much for your comments. And I think both of you made very important points about how we are observers. But my question for you is, for both of you, how do you observe and report what's really going on the ground in a region like Kashmir when there's so many obstacles? How can you tell your respective readers and audiences what the facts are as observers rather than being, fed either fake news or propaganda or a very biased point of view? Let's start with Aditi.
So I think what happens on our side of Kashmir is reported quite widely and quite openly by the Indian media. Of course, it has Indian biases, but it is by and large, Kashmir is pretty much attention grabbing for Indian newspaper and television and digital media consumers. What happens in the Pakistan side of Kashmir, in India, we know very little about. I discovered to my horror that I hadn't even known that Pakistan, Azad Kashmir, was going in for elections later this year. And I had no idea what the status was, what the assembly composition was, how many members were there in the assembly. I just didn't know about all that. So there is a huge lack of knowledge. It's not just about Kashmir's changed status and Pakistan's objections to it and the way Kashmir relates to India as a whole. It's also about the way Indians relate to Pakistani held Kashmir and Pakistan as a country. So it's quite diffuse, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure that Pakistan. I read Dawn almost every day on the online and Express Tribune, and I find that there is enormous appetite, as Kamal said, for things that are happening in Indian Kashmir, and that tells us that the logic of newspaper reporting is so flawed in many ways by this decision not to post correspondence in each other's countries.
Mal, you want to respond?
I think just to follow up on what Aditi has said, honestly, I feel that if journalists are allowed to report freely in both sides, I think it will help create more understanding about
Half the
each other.
problems will be solved.
Yes, I think so.
Absolutely.
I think they are not allowed. They're forced. There's an expectation that you have to follow the national narrative, and if you do not follow that national narrative, which is set by different quarters, is that then you will not be facilitated. You will be harassed. You will be stopped, and that's what's happening. And I think that is the bigger problem, that you have to report what's happening on ground. And at the end of the day, it is foreign journalists who come in, not Indian and Pakistani journalists, who are actually giving the access to report, which I think is a shame. I think we as Pakistani and Indian journalists should be allowed to report what's happening, based on which a lot of misunderstandings will clear up in terms of what's happening on either side.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, we've had 3 stimulating conversations, and now we'll go to questions from the audience. And just a reminder, please specify who you would like your question directed to. So I'll try to take them in order that they came in. The first one is for Shira. The questioner wants to know whether the new Israeli leadership, now that Bibi Netanyahu is finally out of power, at least for now, are they expected to enact any new policies regarding either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority?
So no, I mean, that's a very common question from outside of Israel. You know, what's changed, what will be different in terms of Gaza. So far, we've been seeing a lot of the same because it is such a fragile coalition. The assessment is that they can't afford to, you know, deal with any hot button issues, and there's nothing more hot button than Gaza and doing Gaza. So far, we've just seen, you know, very rough talk that, you know, Israel will not stand for aggression from Gaza, but the truth is there's no simple solution to Gaza. It is such a mess. And also there's no appetite from either Israel or Hamas to start another conflict. That the one that just happened now was also unwanted and very costly in many ways to both sides. So in terms of Gaza and policy, no, not much will change as far as we can understand because of internal Israeli politics, the reality of that.
Thank you, Shara. This question is for Haldon. Palestinians in Jerusalem are considered as residents rather than citizens. What happens if the Israeli government revokes their status? Are there any existing paths to citizenship for them?
Well, this is an old law. In fact, it was applied to every Palestinian within the territories that was occupied in 1967, even to West Bankers. They were residents until the Palestinian Authority came. In the West Bank and Gaza, it a little bit changed. But when it comes to Jerusalem, my wife and kids are registered in Jerusalem, and so they are permanent residents, in fact. So their, let's say, residency can be revoked if the Minister of Interior in Israel decides to revoke that. In practice, it only like deletes all their social rights and medical insurance, but it's a mean of punishing the Palestinians in Jerusalem. They will not be kicked out of the city. They will keep living there, but they will not be given any of the rights. If they want the citizenship, it's a long process, but on the political level, as Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation, few of the Palestinians in Jerusalem go to get the Israeli citizenship. Sometimes they have to because it could make the life easier for them, but most of the people in Jerusalem rejects that because it's like giving the Israelis or giving up your national rights to the Israelis, and you will not be able to claim your right as a Palestinian because you will be an Israeli citizen then.
Thank you. And I have another question for you, which is, what is the view in the Palestinian media about the recent normalization of ties between Israel and some of these Arab states that have been announced over the past year?
It was very criticized by Palestinian media, and to be honest, it went between accusing the Arab countries that normalized of treason or like threatening the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause in general, because the consensus before that was that no normalization with Israel unless the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is solved, unless the Palestinian state is established, and then everything can go as it was mentioned in the Palestinian and the Arab Peace Initiative. What they did was very, very much criticized by the Palestinian media and Palestinian journalists.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. The next question is for Sontek. How do you assess the decision of the South Korean court regarding the slave labor case, which was rejected a few weeks ago? Do you think the ruling was politically driven and influenced by the Moon administration?
Yes. Well, I don't think that the ruling was motivated or politically motivated or driven or influenced by the Moon administration. Actually, I believe there are some group of people in Korea that they trust the traditional way of thinking in regarding this issue. The traditional way of thinking is that the treaty between Korea and Japan in 1965, that particular treaty says that the individual right to claim the reparation was ended by the treaty. It was written in the treaty. The traditional way of thinking, people, they believe individual right was actually over a long time ago. So I believe the court ruling is relied on the traditional way. It is not about political motivation.
Thank you very much. This question is for Kamal and Aditi. How can the people in India and Pakistan be united through their shared history and culture? Could this help in checking raging issues and half-truths concerning the two countries? How about Aditi, you want to go first?
Aditi, you need to unmute your microphone first. You're still muted.
So I'm not sure if there is a one sentence answer to this question. we share a history and we share a culture, but we are very different governance systems. At best, we can manage the relationship. We can never unite. We can never come together again. That is my considered view because of all the history and human beings have enormous gifts. The greatest gift that we have is the gift of forgetting. Between India and Pakistan, unfortunately, that gift uh, can never be put to use.
Just to follow up on what Aditi is saying, in terms of, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to get the reporting. You see, we don't have reporters on ground from either country, so we don't know what's happening in terms of it's just that what the narrative is, we're just listening to that. A very good example of this was when the conflict took place between India and Pakistan a couple of years ago, when the Indian plane came into Pakistan and was shot down. We don't actually still know what happened because India has one point of view and Pakistan has another. There's been no independent reporting. That gives you one idea about the fact that fake news has taken over, and a lot of even in Pakistan, if you look at WhatsApp, a lot of stories about India that come in, half of them are fake, but people believe them. So we have to work on this. We have to work on countering fake news as the first step towards better understanding of each other. We used to have that. I think we've lost that. We need to work on that first.
Thank you very much, Kamal. This question is for Suntek and for Takasugu. How can one separate themselves from the strong currents of nationalism in your two countries? Should nationalism be entirely ignored instead of acknowledging the reality? We'll start with Takasuga.
Thank you for the question. I think we don't fight physically. We don't have a military conflict with ROK, what we see other region. But our big confrontation is on nationalism. So nationalism are in our mind. So Japanese government expressed sincere apology and but the question is that come from their mind? It's a big political conflict between Japan and Korea. So I think it's difficult to manage how manage our nationalism, but I think on our region, the most important things is right now is how to manage China's aggression. So Japan and Korea are both of ally with United States. So we have to cooperate on the current issue beyond our nationalism. So I think as a journalist, I try to the Japanese government and leader what's the important issue for us. Thank you.
Thank you. How about you, Suntek?
Yes, I think nationalism of in Korea and Japan can be overcome because the final goal of the nationalism is getting some kind of a collective pride and national pride, and then those nationalisms in Japan and Korea is something more closely connected to a misunderstanding about the real things. If we overcome, if we get good knowledge if we get a balanced idea, if we get some objective education, we can overcome those misunderstandings. If we get clear of the misunderstandings, it is a very easier way for us to make good alternatives. Actually, in the past, we have a good example of that kind of coordinated approaches. In the year of 1998, former President Kim Dae-jung and the Prime Minister Obama, they made an agreement. In that agreement, there are a lot of coordinated ways, understandings. That could be the good case for two nations, but a couple of years later, since 1998, a declaration, actually there was some kind of different flows. It was scrapped, but I think still we have a good example in the past.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This next question is for Aditi. How do you cover topics such as military brutality, nationalism, and attacks on minorities in India?
Well, we cover them as they happen. Issues of nationalism are complex to cover, but we are reporters and we don't take nationalist positions. Those who take nationalist positions, in my view, are pamphleteers. They're not reporters. So issues of attacks on minorities are a big area of concern and also of coverage, and those are covered by much of the mainstream media and by me personally as well.
Thank you. And then this question is for Kamal. You think periodic meetings of Indian and Pakistani journalists, either online or perhaps in a third country, would improve relations? Or do you think it would invite too much suspicion from your respective governments and intelligence agencies?
Owen, I think both. Of course, it will invite suspicion because journalists meeting each other would help lift a lot of the misinformation that's there, and the governments don't want that. But having said that, I would definitely encourage, like me and Aditi, we were 2006 Jefferson Fellows. We have been in touch. We check with each other when stories come out. I have other colleagues in India. Aditi, I'm sure, has other colleagues in Pakistan who she checks with about stories. So definitely when it comes to misinformation, such meetings, such contacts are very vital for the truth to come out. But I'm sure there are lots of people who don't want this to happen because they want to perpetuate their sort of narrative. So I think that answers your question.
Thank you. Next one is for Sung Tek. What is the role of civil society in bringing about harmonious solutions?
Well, in Korean society, last year we had some kind of a very shameful incident we had. Actually, the civil society, one of the very famous civil institution organization, actually it got us some bad practices, and it was kind of criticized by the comfort women grandma herself. So that kind of thing happened, and nowadays Korean society needs some overall review of the civil society itself. So that kind of think twice, think again, and to check the whole picture, that can provide us for better opportunity to go forward. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This is a question for Takasugu. You mentioned the influence of K-pop stars on young people in Japan. Do you think the next generation might be able to overcome these tensions? Let me add, by the way, that I have a personal interest in this question because my son, who is a music producer, actually wrote a K-pop song called Red Light that many years ago was #1 in Korea for many weeks, so maybe he's an ambassador to improving relations.
Takitsugu, I'm sorry, you
Takitsugu?
have to unmute.
I think you're muted.
Yes, I mentioned right now in Japan, Korean entertainment is booming. For me, it's a little bit odd because anti-Korean sentiment also is spreading. But I don't know how should we analysis between that booming and anti-Korean sentiment. But I believe the young generation's feeling is changing. So that's why I said right now we are in the tunnel, but we can see the tiny light. Thanks.
Great. And I have another question for you. Could Japan play a constructive role in initiating talks between North and South Korea? And then I have a follow-up question, which is, do you think Kim Jong-un has really lost weight?
Yes. So it's a difficult question, but as I said reportedly on the region, the most important things is how to manage Chinese aggression. So Japan and Korea is facing economic difficulties because U.S. is trying to strengthen decoupling from China. Our Japan and Korea is deeply dependent on China on the economic relations. So how to manage between China and the United States on the economic issue. So that's why I think there is a space Japan and Korea cooperate with. Thank you.
Thank you. And then another question for you, Somtek. You had talked about this broad national feeling about victims. And the question wants to know, can perhaps the younger generation of Koreans overcome this victim narrative? And if so, how?
Yeah, I believe we can overcome. Actually, when we think about the relationship between Korea and Japan, it is very long history. It is very long history. Maybe we can continue expand to 2,000 years. Over the course of the 2,000 years, there are many positive periods and negative periods. We are in a negative period, and there was a couple of more negative periods. But we have to remember there were more positive periods too between these two countries. So this long history span show us we have a big possibility to recover the good relationship. And as I told you, the victim mentality, victim narrative was created because of some elements. It was kind of bottled because of some misunderstandings. So if we get some good knowledge, balanced approach, and good history education, those kind of elements weaken the misunderstandings. And then if we can weaken the misunderstanding, wow, that is a good way, good possibility for us to get over. Yes.
Thank you. I believe Haldun has a question he has posed to Shira and the other panelists. Haldun, you want to ask your question?
Yes, I want to ask Shira about her coverage in Israel and if she ever faced any like criticism from Israeli officials or Israeli pro-organization when covering the situation between Palestine and Israel. Sometimes describing Jerusalem or East Jerusalem as occupied territory could launch criticism from the other side. I don't know if you ever been in this position.
I've definitely, constantly, especially during, for example, the conflict last month, there's a lot of pressure from readers. I don't think I've ever had requests from Israeli officials, but definitely pro-Israel organizations or just pro-Israeli readers who really insist on I don't know, on the wording or on the contextualization of a story. And for the most part, I don't change it unless there's a real reason to. But I mean, the reason that I don't change it is because the story is what it is. And I do always try to bring in both voices, the Israeli and the Palestinian. So if, let's say, I was covering the eviction issue in Sheikh Jarrah, so which contributed to the war eventually. I did get a lot of emails from Israelis who were talking about, why I wasn't bringing up more about Jewish heritage and Jewish sovereignty and rights of Jews in the city. However, those often come from foreigners. I mean, the Israelis that I talk to, including everyone, right-wing settlers themselves, actually are very aware of the reality of what a story needs to be in terms of having all aspects. And as long as their voice is heard, they usually don't have complaints. They just want to have their arguments there so that it's not just one-sided, just the Palestinian voice or just the Israeli voice. So it's never been kind of a high-level criticism or request to change information, but usually from readers, there are those requests all the time.
Thank you, Shira. Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask one last quick question of all the panelists, whether any of you in the course of doing your work have been subjected to either harassment, threats, or any other kind of actions that try to deter you from doing the kind of important work that you're doing. Any of you?
I think I'll start because Pakistan is one of the countries where journalists are most at risk. I think not just me, but my colleagues. I was an editor for a national newspaper. It starts with different ways. It's gentle persuasion that moves to messages, veiled messages, threats, kidnapping. Our offices were bombed. So yes, in answer to your question, Owen, we have faced different threats, not just from, and much of this has to do with religious extremism in Pakistan, but at the same time, it has to do with the state. That when we're not following the narrative, when we're going out of the way to give the story in a proper perspective, a lot of people become uncomfortable.
Thank you, Kamal. Anyone else before we wrap up? If not, I would like to just remind our audience the important work that journalists do and that the risks often involved in doing that. I also want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating conversation. And further, I would really like to thank the East-West Center for hosting this event and arranging for all of us to be here. I've done several fellowships with East-West Center, and I think it's a marvelous organization to really bring a lot of important information to journalists who otherwise would not have an opportunity to visit important parts of the world. So thank you for that. And I would like to then turn over the rest of our time to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. As we heard today, covering cross-border conflict is difficult. and it's dangerous. And I very much respect and appreciate the journalists who are covering these challenging stories. What we have learned from our East-West Center cross-border programs is that journalists across hostile borders really want to do factual reporting on their neighbor. They want to connect with experts and people across the border. They are happy to collaborate with neighbor journalists given the opportunity. And you can see Kamal and Aditi are excellent examples of this. We've taken journalists to third countries for dialogues, and we've watched professional and personal relationships grow and deepen. And we have also learned that when we can help get reporting teams across hostile borders, their reports get very high viewership and very high readership because their audiences are craving stories about their neighbors, real factual stories, not just about government and security and military, but about culture and food and movies and trade and all language, all the things that they have in common. So the East-West Center will continue to lead these important cross-border programs. I want to thank our excellent speakers today for sharing their experiences, their challenges, the dangers they face. Thank you so much. Again, I just have so much respect for all of you. Mahalo to our moderator, Owen, and to our panelists, Aditi, Kamal, Shira, Khaldun, Takatsugu, and Suntek. The center is absolutely honored to host such experienced and informed journalists. Thank you as well to our viewers for attending today's EWC seminars live. Also a reminder to please check our cross-border website at journalistsforchange.org. We hope you will join us for a joint EWC seminars live and Gals with Leg global webinar titled Indigenous Voices, Indigenous Environmentalism on Thursday, July 15th from 3:30 to 5 p.m. Hawaii time. Panelist and registration information can be found on our EWC Seminars Live page at www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. So thank you again to our speakers, our moderator. Know that we highly respect and appreciate your work. And to everyone here today, mahalo and aloha from the East-West Center. We look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much.
Aloha.
Aloha, everyone.